just a little bit more about my reaction to the film series. And I know that there were some people who watched the film the other night when Amanda showed it. I, like Jan, I found it a profound experience and overwhelming at times. I grew up reading boys' adventure books that used words like savages to describe the first peoples of this continent. And now I understand that derogatory terms like that flowed directly from the doctrine of discovery. And they've influenced generations of people like me, for whom those words and the attitudes that they express just seemed natural. So my adult life has been a process of undoing some of those deeply held, embedded ideas that were formed during my childhood. Hearing the voices of Indigenous people in the movie expressing their pain and their truth has made me more aware of my judgments. I learned from the film that the underlying assumption of the doctrine of discovery was the superiority of Europeans, and it laid the groundwork for the residential school system in Canada. Jan talked about that, and we see the consequences of that today with intergenerational trauma. I've tried to imagine myself as an Indigenous child from the 1800s, being told that my parents, my community, my connection to the land, my whole way of being, that none of those were worthy of emulation. So if everything that creates my identity is unworthy, then how can I be worthy? Imagining that helped me to understand the power of the doctrine of discovery and the power it still holds. Last month, I attended an evening with Lisa Helps, the outgoing mayor, and she was talking about what the city of Victoria has been doing towards reconciliation. And she has shown quite a bit of leadership. Some of you have probably heard about the series of meetings that she's had called the family. I can't remember, there was another word, family. And so it's basically local Indigenous people and the city talking about reconciliation. And during that conversation, I learned that perhaps a third of homeless people have Indigenous heritage. Yet in Canada, they are 5% of the population. So that imbalance is directly related to the residential school system, which is related to the doctrine of discovery. And in the documentary, they talked about many other statistics, rates of violence, rates of suicide, rates of alcoholism. One of the learnings that I took from the film was contained in an interview with lawyer John Burrows, who is here in Victoria, in the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Studies. And paraphrasing, he said, "What do we want our country to be built on? The idea of superiority and inferiority, or do we want to work together and find ways to persuade one another?" And Burrows said he thinks that persuasion is more the Canadian way of doing things. So this was one of those moments for me that our country is built on that basic assumption of some people being superior to others. I don't feel comfortable being part of that. So it has helped me understand why I think we do need to use terms like decolonizing and settler to help keep reminding us. I also learned that the doctrine of discovery laid the groundwork for our concept of land ownership. And the law continues to assume that sovereignty of the Crown is paramount and that Crown title underlies all of our land, whereas in fact, it comes from nowhere, out of the ether, that, as the movie said, Crown title was just an assertion. I also learned about guilt and responsibility. I don't need to feel guilt because of the actions of my ancestors. However, I do need to take responsibility for the impact of the privilege that I have. If I take no action, then I'm complicit in participating in an injustice. Perhaps during the forum, we can talk about what do we do when we take responsibility. The documentary strongly suggested that we as settlers learn about the doctrine of discovery, that we develop relationships with Indigenous peoples to hear about its impact, that we repudiate, acknowledge that it was wrong. Other ideas include learning about the Lekwungen language here in this land, about Indigenous heritage, and about putting my money where my mouth is through the Reconciliation Contribution Fund that the City of Victoria has established. I'll finish by repeating that quote from Mary Simon that you heard in the piece from Jordan Gray. Mary Simon being our Governor General, who's of Indigenous heritage. And this is what she said: reconciliation is not one act or project, nor does it have an ending. It's a lifelong commitment to learning about Indigenous communities and about the lived reality of their lives. Thanks, Lee.